Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. Today's guest expert is Roderic Yapp. Rod is a former Royal Marines Commando Officer, fortunate enough to lead Marines on operations all around the world, including leading 30 Royal Marines into combat on the front line in Afghanistan and the evacuation of civilians from Libya during the Arab Spring. He also led the recapture of the 55,000-ton MV Montecristo from pirate control in 2011 as part of a Nato counter-piracy task force off the Somali coast. Today, Rod is a CEO of Leadership Forces, a company he founded which focuses on developing leaders within organizations. Some of his clients include HSBC, Deloitte, Jaguar, Land Rover, Royce, and Nato. A great list of companies, and today he is our Modern Leadership guest expert. Rod, so wonderful to have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, we have quite the background that we need to jump into here, and I'm very excited to talk about leadership in high-stakes situations. But before we get into that, is there anything we missed in the bio by way of who is Rod?
So most of those obviously were professional achievements. I'm married, 38 years old. I live in Gloucestershire in the UK. I've got two children, Charlotte, who's 6, and Harrison, who's 3. And they are a little bit like my own sort of leadership troupe at home. A lot of the sort of ways of thinking and a lot of the sort of stuff that I practice in terms of leadership by example, I'll sort of try out with them. So yeah, that's a little bit more of a rounded perspective of myself.
I've been dying to jump into this a little bit and talk about leadership in high-stakes situations because it's exciting to have somebody on here that most of the guests that we've had historically have been authors and writers that come up through a lot of career, a lot of consulting, a lot of speaking background. You started your career differently than most of them in that you were part of the Royal Marines. So tell me, how did you get involved in that? Was it something that you had always kind of thought you were going to do?
Not really. I sort of came to it relatively late. I remember a couple of sort of key moments. Someone at school said to me, we'll never lose touch because we'll all move to London and we'll sort of see each other there. And I remember thinking, I want more from life than that. And I think, when you're in your sort of 20s, at the start of, your professional career, you can afford to take some risk. And so when I was sort of finishing up at university, I looked back and basically my decision making revolves around, if you follow a path whereby you enjoy what you do. So I always chose subjects and things that I enjoy doing. Generally speaking, I found that I tend to be better at them because I'm interested in them. So I looked back and sort of considered what did I enjoy doing at university, and frankly, it was sort of playing sport, playing water polo with my friends, working with a group of people to achieve a common goal. My father was in the Foreign Office, so I sort of believed in this idea of serving my country. And then when I found out about the Marines, it was really just a question of I wonder if I could achieve this. And then I sort of broke down what I was required to do. Passed the potential officers course, passed the Admiralty interview board, which is an assessment of my leadership potential. And then I had a moment of, oh my God, what have I done? I've actually got in. I now have to follow through with this. And that's how I found myself in the Royal Marines.
And I think that's an interesting perspective. I think a lot of leaders and a lot of listeners to this podcast somewhat can relate to the experience of having a dream or having a goal, something that they want to achieve, working towards it, laying it out in a strategic manner, do A, do B, do C in order to accomplish that goal, and then realizing as you're starting to get close to it that what am I thinking? What am I doing? What do I really want? And I think that subconscious kicks in and tries to keep us from achieving the ultimate goal that we have. So tell me, when you went through that experience, how did you find the drive to continue moving in the direction that you wanted to go?
It wasn't a job. It was something bigger than that. I was buying into a lifestyle. I wasn't, becoming a Royal Marines officer was something I wanted to be, not so much something I wanted to do. And in my sort of, my studies of kind of what drives high performance, I came across Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Simon Sinek has taken those concepts and really brought them to a wider audience. And I think that really related to me. Going through some challenging times in training in the Royal Marines, really I could sort of picture myself on the parade square at the end as a Royal Marines officer. And there was just nothing else I wanted to do. And I didn't really have a plan B. I would sort of cross that bridge if and when I came to it. But sort of in my head, I was like, I'm either passing out of training and finishing this, I'm either getting injured and being kicked out, or I'm going to get kicked out because I don't meet the required standard. It was one of three things, and I was going to work as hard as I could to make sure that the first one came true, and funny old thing, it did. So yeah, definitely that sort of sense of purpose and wanting to be something rather than do something, that was really strong for me.
When we talk about like being part of the armed forces or being an athlete, we see that. I mean, we naturally feel this for those who are involved in it, or ourselves when we're involved in it. We see this being and not just doing. How do we translate this now to many of our leaders that are listening today? How do we look at our jobs, whether I'm a real estate agent or whether I'm a doctor or a lawyer or whether I lead a small team or a manufacturing plant? How do I translate that from the job, what I do, to who I am, what I want to be? Because I don't think we make that natural jump like sometimes we do when we talk about people who serve their country or, participate in athletic sports.
The concept of purpose is easily answered if you can ask yourself the question, how do I make the world a better place? Okay. So if you think about, the various sectors that are out there, people in the charitable sector, for example, or in aid or in government service, the public sector, whilst they may have some people that sort of have some motivational challenges because maybe they've been there for a while and they're a bit jaded, they don't tend to have the same challenges that other organizations do. And I think, if you work for a charity, that everything you spend your time on fundamentally makes the world a better place. It makes life better for someone else. Now, if you can connect yourself with that purpose regularly, then it will remind you that even if you're going through some tough and challenging times and you're wading through a big bureaucracy, fundamentally you're making a difference. And I think, it's harder in the private sector, but it's not impossible. And I think, like, if we take, for example, real estate agents, the best real estate agents will not so much be motivated by money and financial performance. I think the best real estate agents will be motivated by the fact that they help people find houses in which to raise their families. That is a far greater connection to making the world a better place than purely for money.
And if we just take a step back and we think about our job and what we're doing, we can all find areas in our lives and in our business that we're making the world a better place. I think what you're talking about is absolutely spot on. I spent 11 years in nonprofit. Clearly, I could walk every day into the office and see the nonprofit that I worked with dealt a lot with young children. We could see the changes in the lives. We could see the leadership principles that they were learning, growing through, and that would impact the future. When you're working in an area that's maybe not as directly impactful, you could still take a step back and think about the impact that you're making. As you mentioned, real estate agents aren't selling homes. They're selling a new lifestyle, a way to raise children, a better place, a better opportunity for the families. If we focus on the impact that we're having societally, what you're saying is that connects us to this. I'm not just trying to do this job. I'm not just trying to fill my pocket with cash. What I'm trying to do is be somebody.
Exactly that. And it's simply, you've just got to keep looking for an answer to that question. How do I make the world a better place? There will be an answer there somewhere. In certain careers, in certain organizations, you might have to work a little bit harder. But yeah, absolutely, it's finding an answer to that question.
So I want to take you back to some of these missions that you led during your time with the Marines. And this is leading in high stakes. I mean, there's a chance that you're not coming back, or members of your team, those that are with you that put their trust in you, are not coming back. A lot of the leaders listening on this show are not in life and death situations when it comes to leading their teams. So give us a little bit of a story of how you led in those high stakes. And then let's translate that over to those listening that are leading at high stakes, but maybe not a life and death situation.
So in the environments that I've led in, where frankly lives are on the line, high performance is not a luxury. It doesn't generate you more money or save you more money. Fundamentally, it sort of saves lives. So I was always deeply curious at what caused teams to perform. You know, if you look at something like the All Blacks or a standout, American football team, why was it that they were doing a particularly good job? Why were they winning? Because I felt if I could kind of deconstruct that and understand the role that the leaders play in those environments, then I could replicate it and do my best to take some of the principles from other environments and apply them to my organization. Fundamentally, yeah, we were working in some very dangerous environments, but we didn't take unnecessary and silly risk with people's lives. Things were well thought through, and we were really careful, certainly at the level of kind of risk that we exposed people to. I think that one of the things that I sort of picked up on and that really sort of shaped me was an understanding of, and you've probably covered this before, but the sort of concept of mental models. It's not so much the problems and challenges you face, it's more kind of how you think about them. And so one of the things that I did was, every time I kind of went out of the front gate from our forward operating base in Afghanistan, was I genuinely thought about it like this. I thought, well, if I get into a firefight, right, if I get shot in the chest, yeah, it's going to hurt, but the plate is going to take it. If I get shot in the arms or the legs, again, it's going to be painful, but my guys know what they're doing. They're going to apply tourniquet. I'm probably going to be on an operating table within the hour. Therefore, in order to get killed, I need to get shot in the face or the neck. Now, in order to do that, they have to be a damn good shot. And the chances of me getting hit with the first 2 or 3 rounds and taking one in the face or the neck was pretty low. So in the back of my mind, I had this sort of concept of a mental model for a firefight. And it was that thinking that allowed me to sort of continue and do my job.
Well, it's that mental model, it's that planning that gives you confidence going in your case, to combat. But in the listeners to this podcast, sitting down and really having a plan for all the possibilities that could happen when you're going in for a presentation, really thinking through step by step what you're trying to accomplish. Stephen Covey always talked about begin with the end in mind. And then plan your day, plan your opportunity, plan your work such that you will arrive naturally at that result. So now you've gone on, you're CEO, you're the founder of Leadership Forces, and you've done a lot of work with some of these great organizations. And one of the things you talk about is leadership. So tell me, Rod, how do you define leadership? What do leaders actually do?
Leaders fundamentally drive performance, shape culture. They get the best out of people, whatever the situation they find themselves in. And the way I kind of think about this is in sort of almost on two levels. So the foundation of good leadership is a sense of self-awareness, understanding yourself, your emotions, what makes you tick, what winds you up, what drives you, so that you can have an understanding of how your behavior impacts other people. The second thing is a sense of understanding the context. A lot of people out there will say, leadership is all about empowerment. It's all about delegating decision-making to the lowest level. And whilst I would agree with that most of the time, there are certain environments, for example, if you come across a car crash on the freeway, you don't want to be empowered in that situation. Often people want to be told what to do because other people are hurt, and it's not time for debate. It's time for quick decision-making. And I think leaders that I've come across that are very good are able to understand the context quickly and choose how to behave accordingly. I've never met a strong leader that can't create clarity within their organization. So they have a really good sense of what is it this team is working towards. Not only do they have clarity around that, it's written down, but everyone is aligned and working on that. if they're not working on something that contributes towards making that end state happen, then they shouldn't be doing it. I think good leaders are decisive. They are comfortable making decisions with imperfect information. That was something that we had to do in the military all the time. I think that they're accountable. They say what they're going to do and they do it, and they hold other people to account. So they hold team members who say, yeah, I'll get this piece of work to you by Friday. They make sure that that piece of work is with them by Friday. And they're comfortable having those conversations around performance. And lastly, I think they're able to build very strong relationships built on trust. And they can almost do this instinctively. This is something that tends to be quite natural for them. So those are kind of what I would consider the sort of foundations. And if I'm working with a leader and there's clearly a deficit in one of those areas, that's the first thing that we're working on.
I want to take you back to the car crash example that you just gave. And I want to ask you if, as we come up on a car accident or any emergency situation, in some people, there's this natural drive to kind of run to it, to get involved, to help where they can. In other people, there's this natural, take a step back. I don't want to be involved. I don't want to get my hands dirty. Is that something that can be taught? Is that something that you are born with, this desire to run in and get involved whenever, the stakes are high, whenever there's a challenge? Or is that something that you just have to be born with?
No, it's definitely something that you can learn. I mean, fundamentally, what we're talking about there is taking control of a situation that is out of control. And that's basically what military officers are taught how to do. So I've been first on the scene in a couple of car crashes in the last sort of few years. And it's just like flicking a switch. It really is. I get in there, I'm literally telling people what to do. People I've never met, people I don't know. I'm saying, right, you back your car up, move around that corner, put your hazard warning lights on, and slow the traffic down so we don't have another pile up here. You're spare, you're not doing anything. Speak to that person. They're clearly hurt, but they're conscious, so they need to be calmed down. Have you spoken, have you called the ambulance? This is where we are. You just absolutely sort of get into it. I almost wouldn't know how to behave in any other way. And that's purely a result of my training.
Well, and you just walked us through a list of leadership traits. And then as you told that story, you basically walked us through those leadership traits one more time, creating clarity. You come up on a situation and the first thing you do is start explaining to people, this is where you need to go, back this up, turn on the hazard light. You're decisive. You were, not asking questions, not really consulting the handbook. You're just kind of going with your gut, your training. Imperfect information. You don't have information when you're the first one up on the scene, but you still have to act. You hold people accountable. You make sure that they're moving in the right direction. And then finally, you build that trust. People can look to you and say, okay, this guy exudes a knowledge that is going to help this situation. And it's interesting that, you kind of systematically walked us through those steps prior to telling the story. And then without even intentionally trying, you walked us through the steps again. And I think that shows that you've really spent your life honing in these leadership traits. And so I wanted to pull that out. And then I wanted to talk to you about this idea of building relationships of trust. Because as you've gone through your career, whether it's the Marine background or whether it's your current role as CEO, you've got to have people trusting you and following you into the work and role and job that they do. So tell me a little bit about how we as leaders can build trust with our teams, especially in short periods of time when, problems arise.
I'm going to take this from a guy I used to work for called Gregory Smith, who's one of the best leaders that I've ever come across. And he had a process that I've evolved and kind of, I used to use parts of it in the military, but I've evolved it slightly. So he said, whenever you take over a team, you need to give them the roadmap to you. So you stand up in front of the group and you say, right, this is who I am. This is where I grew up. This is my family background. This is where I went to university or school. And you basically walk them through your career and your decisions up until pretty much the moment that you find yourselves in front of them. You talk about your family life. You share, whether you've got children, what you do on your weekends. You talk about what you're good at, what you're not good at, what turns you on and interests you, and what bores you. And what you basically do is give them the inside track into who you are as an individual. And then you say, right, this is what I'm working on from a development perspective. Not everyone has everything sort of sewn up. These are the areas that I want you to hold me to account for because I'm trying to improve. And you basically give them an insight into how you think and how you see yourself. The second thing you do is then you one by one, you flip that conversation and you have that conversation with every single one of those people. Now, every single troop of Marines that I led, and the troop is about 30 Marines, I sat down with all of them and asked them those questions purely because I wanted to get to know them. And by expressing an interest in them as individuals, I was demonstrating, and this was heartfelt, that I actually cared about them. And that's how you start to build trust. You demonstrate that you care about this individual. And you ask them things, what is it that you want out of a career in the Royal Marines? Do you want to be a future general, or do you want to, get a trade and get out in a few years? How can I help set you up for success? And that's fundamentally the final question that Gregory actually asked me when I sat down with him. And he was the chairman of the organization. And I was relatively junior at the time, first job out of the Marines. And he finished up with, how do I make you successful? How do I set you up for success? And I was like, that might be the best question anyone's ever asked me. And that is entirely replicable. People can take those things and they can apply them tomorrow in their organizations.
And there's been this move lately to talk more about authenticity and vulnerability, especially in leadership, to let those that you're leading see that you're not perfect, that you do have your weaknesses. And as you were talking through that, that was what came home to me, is that you are human. You're trying to do the best that you can with the knowledge and the background, the experience that you have, and that your relationship building, this relationship of trust that's being built, is not this inauthentic, built on position yourself as an authority without recognizing that you have the things that you're learning as well. And so I want you to talk to us a little bit about this authenticity within leadership and how it helps build relationship trust.
Well, if you watch, and you can try this out yourself, but if you watch anyone express an element of vulnerability, you naturally warm to the individual. You almost want to sort of get closer to them, and you're kind of a bit more sort of accepting.
You can't really help it, right? I mean, you just naturally connect with them.
Exactly that. And I'd love to know kind of where it comes from, but I think it's almost on a sort of genetic level. When someone demonstrates that they don't have all the answers, I think it creates the space for someone to almost sort of close the gap and connect with that individual. And I use it frequently when I'm standing up and sort of talking in front of people, because I know that the sort of marks that I get at the end of that, to some extent, depend on obviously kind of, what is it that I said? Was it useful? Was it helpful? Was it something that someone can practically apply? But an element of it comes down to the fact of whether or not they like me. And likability often comes from expressing a bit of vulnerability.
Yeah, I love that quote there. Likability has an element of vulnerability in it. Before we jump to our last section of the podcast, I wanted to ask you, you lead at home, you lead on your career, you lead on the battlefield. You have leadership in a lot of different areas in your life, throughout your life. And I wanted to ask you, what's harder, leading in the home or leading at work?
It kind of depends on your marriage, I guess. So I would consider it. My view is it's harder to lead. It's harder to lead in the workplace because you don't always have the time to kind of sit down and get to know someone, perhaps with as much detail as you'd like. Depending on what the organisation's like, you may have like real pressure, to sort of drive performance and get things done. Whereas at home, hopefully there is less of that. But I have taken huge lessons from my home life. I think the best lesson I was ever taught on leadership, which really crystallized my thinking around sort of self-awareness and understanding the context, was when my daughter was about 2 years old, and she was up in the middle of the night. She was crying. She was in an absolute meltdown. Anyone who's got a 2-year-old will understand what I'm talking about. And I was sort of trying to approach this problem with an element of kind of logic and go to bed. It's the middle of the night. I'm tired. And it was just not working at all. My wife came in and sort of, kind of not moved me out of the way, but she basically just picked my daughter up and she just stroked her head. She didn't acknowledge anything that she was saying. She just stroked her head. And I was like, oh my God, that's it. That's fundamentally what leadership is all about. Understand yourself, understand where you are not being effective, which was me in this instance, understand the context, and then shape your behavior to get the best out of the situation, which in this context at 3 o'clock in the morning was just stroking the head of a 2-year-old girl to get her back to sleep. That's where that landed from. So I think if you keep your eyes open and if you look out and if you're aware, these lessons come from all over the place.
Talk about leading in a high-stakes situation. 3 a.m., 2-year-old, been there, done that. Sure appreciate Rod sharing that story. It's now time for us to switch to the final section of the podcast, Learning from Leaders, where we find out a little bit more about what's going on in your life. Our first question then is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table. What are you reading these days?
So at the moment, I'm reading Range by David Epstein because I'm really interested in this whole concept of remaining broad before you specialize. And I consider the sort of my own career to have kind of followed that. You know, I was an officer in the Royal Marines for 7 years, so I didn't really understand anything about, you know, anything other than knowing how to sort of fight and lead troops into combat. But that, I think, has massively set me up for success in my second career. So I'm sort of curious to understand other examples of where that's been applied within organizations. So Range by David Epstein, and thus far it's excellent.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about is such a vital leadership lesson, and that is you spent 7 years kind of learning. You didn't jump in today and become a leader. You became a leader through active pursuit of your goals, through actively working, you know, in a follower role, and then earned your opportunity to lead. I love that idea. I love that concept. Our second question then is, what do you consider your leadership superpower?
It's probably an element of curiosity. I have a really strong view that, you know, you should have strong views, evidence-backed, but they should be loosely held. I can't remember where I came across that concept, but I loved it. So if I find a better way of doing something, I am willing to jump onto that ship and go, right, that's a better way of doing it. That's where continuous improvement comes from. So strong ideas, I believe I can back most of my opinions, but loosely held, I am willing to change my mind and find better ways of doing things.
You know, and this curiosity is so vitally important today as we look at the information that we have available at our fingertips, more information than has ever been available in history, and looking at it and saying, you know, there's other people out there that are spending their entire lives diving into one tiny aspect, a niche of what I'm trying to look at, and we can learn from them, we can grow from them, and develop in ways that maybe in the past wasn't quite as, we didn't have that same opportunity. So being curious, being always learning, and really focusing on what availability of information is out there to learn. I love that superpower of curiosity. Our next question is a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra that you live by.
So that's an easy one for me. The man in the arena speech. The credit belongs to the man in the arena. I used to have that pinned up on my office wall, and I used to look at it when things weren't going so well, when I was having a bit of a rough time setting up my business. And it reminded me that, you know, the credit belongs to the guy that's willing to give it a go. And from a philosophical point of view, I love that. And the only reason I don't have it in my office anymore is because I put it up in my son's room, because I want him to read that and I want him to look at that, because it really doesn't matter, you know, what happens, so long as you're willing to give things a go, try it out, learn from the experience. And I think too many people procrastinate and don't really go after what they want because they're scared of failing. And I think that the man in the arena speech speaks volumes to me.
The next generation of leader, your son growing up with that over his head. Finally, the book that you most often gift or recommend to friends, family, and colleagues.
The book that I think it landed with me at exactly the right time, and I thought it was outstanding. But Stoicism and the Art of Happiness by a guy called Donald Robertson. I think that happiness is something that you have to seek out, and it comes from shaping your perspective and being grateful for the things that you've got. I would say that I'm an amateur student of Stoicism. I'm really curious in it, really curious about it. And this book, I think, landed at exactly the right time for me. And I've recommended it countless times now.
Well, wonderful. Rod, it's been tremendous to have you on the podcast to talk about this very unique background that you had and give us perspective of how your background and your experience led you to become the leader that you are today. Before we let you go, how can we find out more about you, connect with you? Where do we go?
Sure. So leadershipforces.com is my website. But I'm an open connector on LinkedIn. So if you want to get in touch with me, just connect, and then you've got my details. You can reach out to me. You can message me. That's probably the best way.
Very cool. And we'll link all of that up on the show notes so they'll have one stop to go and get all of that information, including all the stuff that we talked about on this great episode. Rod, sure appreciate you coming on the podcast today. Couldn't be more excited to learn the leadership lessons from a former Royal Marine and CEO of this great Leadership Forces company. Thank you for being our leadership guest expert.
Thank you very much.
All right, my friends, what did you think of that? You know, as I think about bringing on guests and guests that are interesting to me, and I've said this before, I am the target audience for this podcast. I love the guests that come on. The questions that I ask are things that I'm truly, genuinely interested in. And when I had this opportunity to bring Rod on the podcast to talk about what it's like to lead in high-stakes situations, when lives are on the line, when intensity and emotions are high, and how that translates into our daily lives and how we can be leaders regardless of what activity we're doing. How do we apply these principles to our leadership lives? All right, as you know, everything that we talked about can be found on the show notes for this episode, jakeacarlson.com/ML156, episode 156. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days and even better life. And remember, everything in leadership is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.